Welcome to the HL7 Da Vinci Community Roundtable. Today's session is about advancing interoperability via FHIR APIs and industry discussion on progress, proposed rules, and the value of automation. My name is Alex Goss, and it is my pleasure to moderate and present in today's Community Roundtable and to remind all of us that we engage in these forums under HL7's antitrust policies to ensure appropriate collaboration and information sharing. We are grateful for your participation in the February Community Roundtable, Da Vinci's educational monthly webinar. In addition to providing key HL7 Da Vinci updates and news, we have a terrific panel of experts who will discuss our industry's current inflection point on our collective journey to improve patient outcomes through enhanced data capabilities, workflow automation, and more efficient use of resources in the healthcare system. I'll be joined by Kirk Anderson, Chair of the HL7 Da Vinci Project Steering Committee and Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Cambia Health Solutions. Hans, also with the Steering Committee as our Vice Chair and a Director of Interoperability Strategy at Oracle Health. Crystal Green, Clinical Data Exchange Co-Lead and eSolutions Senior Business Consultant and Advisor with Elevance Health. Viet Nguyen, our Technical Director and HL7 Project with the HL7 Project, Da Vinci Project, and Chief Implementation Officer of HL7. Also, Samira Singh, the Director of Population Health and Informatics for Providence, and Denise St. Clair, also with the Da Vinci Project PMO and Research Project Manager at Acumen. We've included time to take audience questions and appreciate that Jocelyn Keegan will be moderating that segment of our panel interaction. So please use the question function in GoToWebinar throughout today's session to submit your questions. Before we dive in to today's presentations and panel discussion, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. So in addition to the time allocated for Q&A, please be aware that we will post the recording of today's webinar and slides on Da Vinci's video presentation page on Confluence. Da Vinci's communication lead, Leslie Amoros, will be posting links in the chat box to assist in locating that page and other resources you may find of interest that we're speaking to today. We've muted lines to aid our recording quality, and should you encounter audio issues, we suggest rejoining the webinar or obtaining the audio dial-in information provided in your registration. Finally, we really appreciate your survey feedback that we'll solicit at the conclusion of the webinar. All right, so now that we've done the housekeeping, let me also just make sure you're aware that our next community roundtable session will be March 22nd. And as I noted, you can get the recording and slides on our video presentation page. At the end of 2022, the Da Vinci Project modified its membership and fee structure while also seeking additional members interested in creating and implementing standards that enable efficient, value-based care exchanges. In particular, we're focused on missing stakeholders, small and community-based providers, regional, Medicaid CHIP, QHP plans, and missing integration partners such as EHRs and platforms, including those for population health. So please consider this opportunity and join us in the journey to increased standards through FHIR by contacting the Da Vinci PMO with your questions or your interest in joining. As for events, I wanted to make sure you're aware that in addition to the upcoming VIVE conference at the end of March and the HIMSS 23 conference in April, WEDI is currently surveying industry on proposed rules related to prior authorization and attachments. The responses are anonymous and no individual identifiable information is collected in the survey. The aggregated results of this important WEDI survey will be used to help inform their formal response to the proposed rules and may be shared during public sessions, webinars, or other events. It'll take approximately 10 minutes to complete once you know your answers. And what they've done to be helpful in preparing those answers is provided a PDF of the survey questions, which you can get at the link on this page. So Viet, I'd like you to come on screen with me and take it away and talk about our upcoming HL7 events.
Thank you so much, Alex. I wanted to take this opportunity to invite you all to our first ever Working Group Meeting Plus. For those of you who are HL7 regulars, you know that we have a 3-time-a-year working group meeting where our community comes together to work on HL7 standards. And this work is preceded by our FHIR Connect-a-thon. With the support of the HL7 board and the community, we've decided to expand our working group meeting, and we're going to call it the Working Group Meeting Plus. And it will follow on in May of our working group meeting as part of the follow-on from our FHIR Connect-a-thon, and it will be held May 8th through 12th. So if I could have the next slide. So why do we want to have a working group meeting plus, and what does the plus mean? For us, the plus really means we want to expand the participation of the implementer community in the HL7 working group meeting and the HL7 community. Many folks don't attend a working group meeting because historically they think that, oh, it's just standards work and I'm not really a standards developer. But the reality is standards development is part of a whole life cycle of work that we do, where we need to engage the industry in developing these standards, but also want to support the implementer community in understanding that. So the goal is to expand the content of this Working Group Meeting Plus to provide useful content to the rest of this community in order to host important conversation discussions around standards and standards implementation, as well as to advance your implementer education and engagement in the community, especially around FHIR, and then to further showcase what we've done with FHIR implementation guides, open source tools, reference implementations, and ultimately to grow the HL7 community. So next slide, please. So who should attend? And I'm just pretty much going to say everyone. Anyone who may be involved in either standards policy development, the standards development that we historically have done in HL7, those of you who are part of organizations who either must implement these standards or, importantly, purchasers of technologies that implement these standards, and even those of you who don't know the standards deeply, but want to get involved in providing your subject matter expertise around the workflows that these standards are involved in. So we want to invite policymakers, executives, business owners, architects, developers, researchers, and we want to have folks who have no idea what we're doing in FHIR, but so we're glad you're here today. And we want to expand and advance your knowledge and state of the art around FHIR and around our standards. Next slide, please. So how are we going to do this? We have a broad overall theme, and that theme is the role of policy in the advancement of healthcare interoperability, standards development, and adoption. And the fact that you're here and you're looking forward to hearing more about the discussions around the proposed rules, we're sure that you have some interest in policy. And so we want to start to bring the community of policy makers, as well as policy, those who have to comply with policy, along with the standards community, in order to have better communication so that we can start closing the gap in understanding around the role of policy and standards. Next slide. So we'll have a number of different sessions during the week of the Working Group Meeting Plus. We'll have invited folks from the regulatory agencies who are writing policy, such as CMS and ONC, CDC, FDA, NIH, all those 3-letter acronyms that you're so familiar with. We'll also have parallel tracks around general sessions where we'll have deep dives into our implementation guides. We'll have panels discussing their experience in implementation, and we have worked with the working group co-chairs and the community of the developing the standards to try to provide a good schedule for them so that their regular members to the work group can also take advantage of these sessions as well. And really, there'll be tracks for business owners as well as technical folks. And then we hope to have some additional hot topics that we'll be adding along the way that might be of special interest to the broader community. Next slide. So we've laid it out. If you're come on Monday or arrive before Monday, we'll have a day of education. So we'll be talking about basic FHIR for business owners and policy folks. We'll talk about how to read implementation guides, about US Core, and overview of the FHIR accelerators. And then we'll really dive in on Tuesday with that core knowledge that you've learned about FHIR to talk about US realm policy with topics around US CDI and TEFCA, as well as ONC topics, CMS topics around burden reduction and measures. Wednesday is global and public health policy, along with parallel deep dive sessions from the accelerators. Thursday will be around clinical and research topics led by the discussions from FDA and NIH. And of course, all along the week, we'll have technical tutorials for folks who are more focused on understanding and learning about FHIR more deeply. So with that, next slide. We'll be having a detailed schedule for you at the beginning of March. We're working with the work group co-chairs to make sure that we can best accommodate the work that has to be done at our usual work group meetings while still allowing them the opportunity to meet and participate with the folks, the new folks, as part of the Working Group Meeting Plus. So you'll see more information at hl7.org, and we want to encourage you to come join us. We think it's going to be a great event and lots of great information, no matter where you are in your FHIR journey. Thank you. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you so very much, Viet. That was a really great overview, and we hope to see you all in New Orleans. There's nothing like being in person and leaning into understanding policy and the intersection with technical standards. So at this point, what I'd like to do for the first part of our main event, I'd like to invite Kirk Anderson to come on screen and kick us off with setting context before Denise St. Clair and I provide additional context and updates around Da Vinci's response to the proposed rules that are providing us with a tremendous opportunity to reflect on our journey to better care for patients. Kirk.
Great, thanks Alex, and good afternoon everyone. Thanks for carving out the time to come together today as a community. I hope everyone is staying safe and is not caught up in too nasty of weather situations. I'm here in downtown Portland, Oregon, and I'm just noticing that the snow is starting to really come down, which means I'm going to have an adventurous ride home when we finish today. We do have a full agenda, and of course, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I'm going to keep my welcome remarks brief. But whenever we do have an opportunity to come together collectively like this, it always seems like a good time to take a step back and look at the big picture of what we have accomplished, all of us, with this, what is now over a 6-year-old project called Da Vinci. And those of you not part of Da Vinci who have also been leaning in to this vision of healthcare interoperability. But to just kind of put into context the progress that we're making and the path that lies ahead. I think for me personally, one of the greatest satisfactions that I have as a member of this unique collective initiative of payers and providers and EMR and other health IT vendors is that we have truly moved now into what I call full-on implementation phase. And what I mean by that is, unlike in the first couple of years of our existence, we're no longer simply advocating for an idea or a concept. That concept being that in embracing open standard FHIR APIs, we would find the best path forward not only for value-based care, but to modernize the way that payers and providers interoperate every day. Now we're actually doing it. So it's no longer just a great idea that we think is the future, it's happening. And it's happening not just in connectathons like Viet just mentioned, but in real world production use cases that are benefiting real patients and real providers and producing efficiencies for payers and providers that help reduce waste in healthcare. Leveraging Da Vinci implementation guides, we're seeing payers and providers and those health IT vendors that we partner with collaborating together to implement FHIR API-based solutions for all kinds of different use cases, for exchanging data in bulk for quality measure reporting, for surfacing our RX formularies and provider directories, for patient attribution, and in the summer of 2022, for real-time end-to-end processing of prior authorization using FHIR APIs. And what's more, we're starting to see the realization of what has always been part of this vision. That is that the health IT vendors, the EMR vendors and others, starting to incorporate Da Vinci use case support into their out-of-the-box product offerings. That's awesome. And I'm encouraged, but not surprised, actually, that many of us as payers and providers, as we're out shopping for vendor technology solutions, increasingly requiring Da Vinci use case support in the RFPs that we're sending to those vendors. Of course, there's no doubt that all this momentum toward FHIR APIs becoming that new mainstream in payer-provider collaboration has been greatly accelerated by federal rulemaking. And we continue to see our work in Da Vinci forming the basis of new federal regulation and RFIs. We're seeing it in prior auth. We're going to talk about this later today. And over the last couple of years for patient cost transparency, for advanced EOBs. And we're seeing it now not only from CMS in their focus on payers, but now also from the ONC in their RFIs for prior auth, and in how Da Vinci's work is emerging as a key accelerator in the ONC's TEFCA roadmap, as ONC leader Mickey Tripathi shared with us in the Da Vinci community recently. And so if you take all these things together, it's really becoming undeniable that we have reached that inflection point as an industry to finally embrace modern architectures, things like RESTful APIs that are very common outside of our industry, that allow us to break down these historical silos and data fiefdoms that have contributed over the years to so much unnecessary cost in healthcare. They've created a drag on clinical outcomes and that have discouraged and disempowered patients trying to navigate the American healthcare system. And it's also contributed to abrasion and burnout among those of us who deliver care to patients and help patients pay for that care. I think, we're excited about all the Da Vinci use cases. They're all there for a reason. They're there because payers and providers have identified them not only as key business challenges, but as great opportunities to use FHIR APIs to solve those challenges. But I think prior auth is in many ways a perfect example of this opportunity. And I want to applaud CMS for their efforts reflected in their latest NPRM to drive the country to FHIR APIs for prior auth. Why is that such a big deal? So as you've heard, those of you who have heard me talk about this, have heard me say many times that true interoperability in healthcare is not about common data standards. We've had lots of common data standards in healthcare for decades. True interoperability in healthcare is the power of APIs. It's not proprietary APIs. It's not APIs that only work if all of us bought the exact same vendor solutions. We know that's never going to happen. But open standard APIs for healthcare, which is, of course, what HL7 FHIR provides us. And it's these APIs that let, at the simplest way to think about it is, this is what lets the computer applications inside providers and inside payers communicate with each other directly without human intervention. And it's what allows us to collectively solve some of these complicated business processes like prior auth as a single interoperable workflow process that spans those organizational boundaries of payer and provider. Provider clicks a button inside an EMR and a payer system responds in real time. That's huge. The provider doesn't have to leave their EMR, which they really don't like doing. We hear that all the time within the Da Vinci community. They don't want to have to go to the payer's portal to do something to interact with the payer. The digital front door for providers to payers of the future is the provider's EMR system. That's the vision. And to do that, you need APIs. You need more than data standards. So what we've done in prior auth recently as an example, and I know we have a panel coming up, so we might be able to speak to it in some more detail, but is to achieve that vision, right? So I'm not just talking about something in the distant future. Using the Da Vinci implementation guides that have been built collaboratively by payers, providers, and health IT vendors, and a waiver from CMS that Da Vinci was granted to pilot this idea of a purely FHIR API powered prior authorization process. Regents, one of Cambia Health Solutions companies, working together with Multicare, one of our biggest provider systems, MCG, who is Regents' clinical care guidelines vendor, and Epic, put this into production in the summer of 2022. It's purely FHIR API driven end to end, and it achieves that vision that we set out as sort of our North Star within Da Vinci, to do this in a way that allows providers to stay in their workflow, that is secure and scalable across many payers and providers, all payers and providers, so long as we're all building to the open standard of FHIR APIs. So more to come on that, I suspect. We're also here to talk about not only that prior auth in PRM and the other elements of that were included in what's being called the Interop 3.0 rule, but also the attachments rule. And so without further ado, I want to just quickly thank everyone again for all of your participation today, but also everything that you're doing in your day jobs to help bring this vision to reality of a truly interoperable healthcare system. So with that, I will kick it back over to you, I think, Alex.
Thank you so very much. I think Denise St. Clair is up next, and I'm going to run her slides. There you go. We can see you and hopefully hear you.
Hopefully.
Yes, thank you.
That's always a good thing. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to take a little bit of time today to talk to you about what we affectionately refer to as Interop 3, the Notice of Public Rulemaking currently out for comment from CMS. And for those who are wondering how we got to Interop 3, Interop 1 was the Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rule, which was the first final rule related to FHIR-based APIs. Interop 2 is the rule that came out as a proposed rule in December 2020, but wasn't finalized. And actually, that rule is officially withdrawn as part of Interop 3. And then now we have Interop 3, which is the rule that is currently out for comment and expanding on policies that were finalized in Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rule, and will look familiar to those of you who read the December 2020 proposed rule, as a number of the policies in this rule were foreshadowed in that proposed rule. So we'll take a minute and just talk a little bit at a very, very high level and very quickly about what some of the proposals are in the rule, then a little bit about what the Da Vinci community is thinking about as we are working collectively to put together a Da Vinci response to the rule as part of the official comment process. And for those who are looking to submit their comments, again, these are officially due on March 13th, I believe, to CMS for this rule. So the rule is officially the Advancing Interoperability and Improving Prior Authorization Processes rule. It impacts Medicare Advantage organizations, Medicaid and CHIP fee-for-service payers, Medicaid and CHIP managed care organizations, and qualified health plans on the federally facilitated exchanges. So it's the same group of payers who were impacted by the interoperability and patient access final rule. What will look familiar is the first API on the list. So the patient access API was finalized in the interoperability and patient access final rule and is added to, enhanced, one would say, in this proposed rule. And then this rule also proposes a provider access API, a payer-to-payer API, and a prior authorization requirements, documentation, and decision, or PARD, or PARD-D, depending on who's reading the acronym, API. In addition, there are some additional prior authorization policies that are also included within the proposed rule. From a Da Vinci perspective, we are very much focusing on how Da Vinci, through the Da Vinci implementation guides, can support these proposed requirements. And if there are any technical or policy considerations, we suggest CMS review to ensure the most successful implementation of the rule, however the policies are ultimately finalized. The patient access API is very much building on what was previously finalized. So as many of you know, the patient access API requires that payers at a minimum make available adjudicated claims, including provider remittances and enrollee cost-sharing encounters with capitated providers, and clinical data, including laboratory results, with a date of service on or after January 1, 2016, those data maintained by the payer be made available through the patient access API so that a patient can receive those data through a third-party app of their choice. So that remains true. And then what the rule does is it proposes adding some information to the patient access API, and specifically prior authorization information. The same prior authorization information that is proposed to be added to the patient access API is also proposed to be included in both the provider access and payer-to-payer APIs as well. So you have that synergy there to support sharing the same data with all patients, providers, and other payers. So the rule is proposing that impacted payers make information about prior authorization requests and decisions and related administrative and clinical documentation for items and services excluding drugs be available to patients no later than 1 business day after the payer receives the prior authorization request, or there is another type of status change to the prior authorization request. So for the patient access API, this would be another piece of information or set of information available to patients through that third-party app of their choice. So that is the addition to the patient access API. As we note here, there are recommended but not required implementation guides currently for the patient access API as finalized, and as proposed, that continues. So specifically noted are the Karen IG for Blue Button, the Da Vinci PDEX IG, as well as the PDEX drug formulary IG, and then the HL7 US Core IG is supporting the sharing of US CDI version 1 as well. And so those are sort of the primary set of IGs, and then depending on the type of data available through the particular API, essentially those same suite of IGs can support the provider access and payer-to-payer APIs. So these new APIs, as proposed, and I will mention one more thing before going to the provider access API, there's also a proposal for the patient access API for payers to annually report metrics to CMS about the use of the patient access API. So that is another proposal in the rule. For the provider access API, consistent with the technical standards and recommended IGs for the patient access API, the provider access API would or proposes to have payers make available to providers any of the data exchanged currently in the patient access API, excluding provider remittances and cost sharing. So same idea in terms of the data, just removing the remittances and cost sharing. And that's true for the payer-to-payer API. So basically same exact data, except for remittances and cost sharing being proposed to flow from payer to provider. For the provider access API, payer to payer would be new payer receiving data from an old payer, or concurrent payer sharing data, and then obviously the payer sharing the data to the patient with the patient access API. So it's ensuring that same set of data is sort of flowing throughout the industry and providing that true line of sight for everyone regarding this patient data, and in all three, the new proposal for prior authorization information. And so the other difference between the provider and payer, provider access API and payer API, in addition to removing remittances and cost sharing, is adding a proposal to leverage the HL7 FHIR bulk data access IG to support sharing data for more than one patient at a time, and of course also asynchronous data sharing for a single patient. So that's another piece of this puzzle. For the provider access API, the rule proposes that a patient could opt out of the data sharing. They could let the payer know, and the payer would have to set up a process to be able to record that a patient does not want their data shared with a provider. And as proposed, it's basically all or nothing, so share with any or all providers. And for the payer-to-payer API, the rule explains that due to a number of regulatory and legal realities, it would be an opt-in. So as a patient, for instance, I'm enrolling in a new health plan. As part of my application and enrollment form for that health plan, I can indicate who my previous payer is, my ID with that previous payer, and therefore provide information to my new payer about how to retrieve information from my previous payer. So that's another piece of this puzzle and the proposals that are included here. So that's the high level of what's in the patient access, provider access, and payer-to-payer APIs. And then, of course, there's also the prior authorization requirements, documentation, and decision API. And that API is proposing to leverage, as the recommended IGs, the Da Vinci Covered Requirements Discovery, or CRD IG, the Document Templates and Rules, or DTR IG, and the Prior Authorization Support, or PAS IG. And what this API would do would be permit payers and providers to be able to leverage FHIR to expose what are the requirements for prior authorization, what documentation is needed for prior authorization, and facilitate sharing that HIPAA compliant prior authorization request through a FHIR-based API. And so that is, there's a lot of detail and nuance here, but I'm sure many of you have already been digging into this, so we don't want to take too much time there. But it really does provide an opportunity to set this process on fire and enable the efficiencies of that data sharing. And in hopes, the one big hope is to speed up that process, which then also relates to some of the additional requirements that are proposed in the rule, including speeding up the time for prior authorization requests and the like. So the other standards that are implicated in this rule are noted here. These are sort of the base standards of FHIR 4, US Core, US CDI version 1, OAuth2 Connect, OAuth2 OpenID Connect, and as we mentioned, the FHIR bulk data access. Unlike the other IGs, these proposed standards are the proposed required standards. The other IGs are recommended. And all policies are proposed to have a compliance date of January 1, 2026. So with a very high level idea of what is actually in the rule, we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what the Da Vinci community has been talking about as we've been having conversations around both this rule and, as Alex will speak to in a second, the attachments rule. What as a community are we thinking makes sense for us to comment on to CMS about these rules? And what it really boils down to is that the Da Vinci IGs that are recommended can provide the tools to support the functional requirements however they're finalized. Based on the proposed rules, either the IGs as they are currently in flight or updates that would be necessary could be made to ensure that by January 1, 2026, we could provide tools to help industry be in compliance with these rules. And so that really is the underlying theme. There are a couple of opportunities for us to advance Da Vinci IGs to support the proposals in this rule. For instance, we can advance the PDEX IG to fully support the proposal for documentation exchange for the prior authorization information sharing in the patient access, provider access, and payer-to-payer APIs. We can work to ensure that PDEX can support bulk member match and bulk asynchronous exchange for multiple members. Currently, PDEX can support for a single member, but we can ensure that that bulk for multiple members as proposed would be accommodated. And in terms of attribution, there's obviously mentioned in the rule of the Da Vinci attribution guide, but there's also ways that perhaps PDEX can support this process, such as including a flag for, say, those patients who have opted out of provider data sharing and are otherwise attributed to the practice. So there are ways that we can continue to iterate on the PDEX IG within the PDEX work group to further support the proposals. We also have noticed a couple of technical considerations we'd like to encourage CMS to consider. Revisiting, for instance, for the payer-to-payer API, the OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect standards are noted for authorization and verification. However, for the purposes of a business-to-business, server-to-server, a transaction, the desire may be to look at something other than ID Connect, which often sort of assumes a person at one end of the transaction. So that's a recommendation that we can make from a technical side of things. And then the community thinks it's important to really talk about advancing IG versioning. Obviously, that's something that CMS does already mention in the rule. It's something that's also considered in the in, say, ONC's SVAP process, of standard version advancement process. But just understanding even today that the versions that are mentioned in the rule are, STU1, for instance, for PDEX, but STU2, which is going through the balloting process, or has completed the balloting process and we are targeting toward publishing that in the next couple of months, really does cover most of the functionality that would be required. So it's really important to ensure that there's a really clear path and clear understanding for all payers and providers and vendors and everyone involved in this process, how that versioning process would work and how to best support everyone in that process that we move from IG to IG. And then in terms of some policy considerations, one of the things that the community has brought up is really the importance of not just denial reason codes, but reason codes and ensuring a standard set across industry for everyone to use, aligning with the X12 278 to ensure that regardless of how prior authorization is being done, everyone knows what the codes they're receiving mean. Endpoint discovery, obviously very, very important, making sure you can find the providers and payers you're looking for. The CMS recently had the National Directory RFI, and Da Vinci responded to that, and that's something that the community would like to elevate as a very important piece of this puzzle. There is a request for prior authorization metrics to be submitted by payers, and we've talked about the value of sort of thinking about that in terms of those that are API supported and those that are not, and maybe even automating some of that to help reduce burden there. And then we discussed the opportunity to incentivize the use of the PAR-D API by, in fact, including that in the MIPS program, one of the incentives that is noted in the rule and/or through ONC certification, which is another recent RFI that Da Vinci responded to. So that's sort of where the community is at now. We're in the process of working through a draft response. And very happy to continue the conversation on this. And with that, I am going to hand it over to you, Alex.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Denise. Appreciate that update. Whereas Denise spoke to a proposed rule for Interop 3 that with a March 13th due date, I'm going to speak to the attachments NPRM, which has a March 20th due date. This administrative simplification related proposed rule is fully titled Adoption of Standards for Healthcare Attachments, Transactions, Electronic Signatures, and Modification to Referral and Authorization Transaction Standard Proposed Rule. And it contains a handful of components. If you want a deeper dive on either of these proposed rules, we did have a tremendous session in January at the Community Roundtable, where CMS, Office of Burden Reduction, and the National Standards Group delivered an extensive overview. So we encourage you to go take a look at those recordings and slides if you are so inclined. Well, let's focus in on sketching out what's in the attachments NPRM, and before I dive into talking about the Da Vinci community's status regarding the comment response to this proposed rule. So the attachments NPRM has a set of HIPAA attachment standards and related definitions for electronic exchange of clinical and administrative data to support both prior authorizations and claims adjudication. It's important to recognize that the attachment definition changes from the original scope of the HIPAA law to now include prior authorization requests in addition to the claims scope, which was the initial HIPAA Act. The proposed attached HIPAA standards would name implementation guides using X12 EDI transport, the 275 and 277 transactions, with an HL7 clinical document architecture payload. So think of X12 for the transport, and the real clinical content would be the HL7 CDA as proposed. Additionally, they're proposing modification to the existing HIPAA standards for referral certification and authorization, which we affectionately refer to as the 278. The final component of the attachment's proposed rule is related to electronic signature policies. In contrast to Denise's overview, I'm going to jump quickly into the attachments rule to talk about our perspectives, as I know that we can all get a much more deeper dive from Dan Kaula's excellent overview at the January Roundtable. So from the Da Vinci perspective, we have engaged in numerous conversations over the past 2 months, including our NPRM member group twice weekly meetings and standing governance layers, including our operating committee, our clinical advisory committee, and member forum. We are very much still in progress, as many of you are, in completing the critical deliberations essential to finalizing the formal response submission. But we are certainly close enough for me to share our perspectives and key concerns. Da Vinci members are industry leaders and health IT technical experts who are working together to accelerate the adoption of HL7's Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource, or FHIR, as the standard to support and integrate value-based care, or VBC, data exchange across communities. We are very much leaning into our mission as the basis on which we will submit our response, ensuring our focus is on the items most germane to our role in this broad healthcare ecosystem. Value-based care programs strive to enable providers and payers to see the right data at the right time for specific patient coverage, benefits, and care coordination. The Da Vinci Project is advocating for the model embraced by Interoperability 3 proposed rule we just heard Denise speak about, and is concerned with the attachment proposed regulation. These two rules don't fit together. Rather, they're incongruent and on a collision course with their very different approaches to achieving the goals of interoperability, reduced burden, and administrative simplification principles. Many of us, including me, have been on the journey to name and attachment standards for decades. The proposed rule leverages industry testimony from 2016, which at the time reflected the best of breed thinking in the industry. Those 2016 recommendations on which the NPRM is based occurred several years before our national policy and business initiatives embraced RESTful API and modern technologies that are key to having the right data at the right time without special effort. For example, the Da Vinci Project was formed in 2018, and the patient access APIs related regulations were promulgated in 2020. In 2023, efforts are advancing clinical data exchange and prior authorization solutions using FHIR-based approaches. We're making the standards real and tangible in workflows. In particular, HL7 Da Vinci's Clinical Data Exchange Implementation Guide, or CDEX, is continuing to mature beyond its initial publication as an HL7 standard, with its second publication expected shortly. CDEX functionality supports the goals reflected in the proposed rule and provides the flexibility and capabilities needed in today's healthcare information exchanges. Industry is investing in CDEX in multiple ways, such as participating in Da Vinci conference calls and the project, maturing the CDEX standard, attending HL7 Connectathons to test it out, and funding and allocated resources to internal projects that will leverage the CDEX IG, or implementation guide, as a part of its product stack. Thus, Da Vinci is not in favor of finalizing the proposed regulations. Advancing the proposed rule would formalize the disconnect with 21st century cures capabilities and related investments to support interoperability, reduced burden, and better patient outcomes. A final rule would require investments across the country that essentially lead to hardwiring the approach, making further evolution that much harder and burdensome. A final rule would redirect industry focus and precious resources on compliance rather than development of modern, efficient capabilities to better meet patient needs and address burnout in our healthcare system. Industry, payers, providers, clearinghouses, vendors, patients, and more, has to make choices at each step of the interoperability journey, and finalizing these regulations brings complications for the choices already made and those to come. We all know that the reality that technology moves faster than policy advancements, and we're still working out how to work with this reality given the policy frameworks solidified under the HIPAA Act and its regulations, American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, HITECH, or Health Information Technology and Economic Clinical Health Act, to the 21st Century Cures Act related regulations. There is a critical need, should the attachment proposed regulation be finalized, to improve the clarity of the attachment definition. Our interpretation is the current definition permits a kitchen sink approach to the eligible activities to which the mandated standards would apply, versus the definition of attachments succinctly being tied to a specific transaction, such as the claims transaction, also referred to as the 837s. Further, finalized regulations would need to include accurate or missing implementation guide standards. The proposed rule references outdated versions or are only included in the preamble language. For instance, the attachment implementation guide that's referenced from 2017 is now retired and replaced by a 2022 version. The electronic signature standard noted in the preamble is missing from 162.2002 F to name the HL7 implementation guide for CDA Release 2 for digital signatures and delegation of rights, Release 1. The Da Vinci Project intends to share our formal response submission once approved and appreciates the opportunity to give you a status today of where we currently stand as you consider how to advance your own submission response. With that said, that's a lot of information to take in. So let's change gears a little bit, and I'm going to invite my panelists to come on stage and on screen, I should really say, and we're going to engage in a series of back and forth conversation and questions that we've prepared before Jocelyn Keegan will then moderate the questions that you've submitted during this session today. So I am looking for a few more faces to come on board, especially Kirk, because I'm going to kick it off with Kirk. There he is. Okay. Denise will also be here to support us in Q&A as we go forward. But I'm grateful for our panelists today. I am going to kick it off with Kirk. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't have to look at that while we're having our Q&A panel. Yes, okay, Kirk, we're glad you're getting some lunch. You are on West Coast time. So Kirk, you and your provider partners took advantage of the waiver CMS granted Da Vinci members to do a purely based FHIR authorization solution. Please describe the experience and the benefits demonstrating the FHIR-based prior authorization support implementation guides as an alternative to the HIPAA 278 transaction.
Sure. Yeah. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the reason that we were granted a waiver by CMS to do a purely FHIR API-driven prior authorization solution is because without that waiver, technically, in doing a prior authorization, the X12 278 transaction is necessary. But while it's necessary, it doesn't add any value to the actual distributed business process that we wanted to demonstrate. And I think CMS encouraging us to prove that it was viable to use just APIs to complete this process end to end. And when I say end to end, I'm referencing the 3 Da Vinci implementation guides that are called out in the CMS rule that was dropped. That is the coverage requirements discovery, the DTR use case documents, templates, and rules. Requirements, thank you. I always forget that one. And the prior authorization support, the final round trip that communicates the determination back to the provider. So in delivering this, what we've done is we've leveraged the open standard SMART framework that allows us to create technical capabilities that work across different EMRs, any EMR that is SMART compliant, which is most EMRs. We implemented this specifically using Epic, and so worked closely with Epic to make sure that this all worked as designed. And as I mentioned just briefly in my opening remarks, there's a lot of benefits in doing this work in this way that we are realizing now that we have real patients and real providers using it. I'll briefly cover a couple of those. One of the key ones, and this is feedback we hear from providers over and over, is as they are working with payers, they don't want to have to navigate all these different payer portals. They call it portalitis, payer portalitis. This payer wants us to go to this portal for prior auth, this portal for care gap closure, this portal for risk, how we're performing in a value-based care contract. And then you multiply that by, a provider who has to work with 30, 40, 50 different payers. You can understand that perspective. So we achieve that by, again, leveraging APIs so that the front door, the thing the human is interacting with, is their regular system, not a payer portal. So that's number one. The second thing is, and this is massive, and it actually relates back to some of the points you were making about the attachments rule, Alex, is with this solution, we're not just making it such that providers don't have to leave their EMR workflow. The other key pain point that providers have is trying to anticipate, well, what's all the clinical data that the payer is going to require from me to approve this prior auth? That's a very standard scenario, right? Where the answer is, well, maybe the prior auth is approved. We need some more clinical data to make that determination. And what happens today is providers, not knowing exactly what might be needed, kind of throw the kitchen sink over to the payer. Maybe they are uploading it manually through one of those payer portals I mentioned, or they're faxing us or emailing us, or they're sending us huge tranche of data, much of which we don't need as payers. The solution, because it's API driven, allows us to get the very specific data out of the EMR that is needed, no more and no less. And so that's another huge benefit that is saving time on the provider side and the payer side with this solution. I think I've taken more time than you wanted me to, so let me stop there. And if there's any follow-on in the chat, I'm happy to.
What we would suggest is maybe you turn your video on and off because you have frozen in a very poignant way.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. Appropriate. It was all good, but you did freeze up for us in your video, but your audio came through just fine. So, some great context to really talk about boots on the ground, reality of getting value from implementing the FHIR IGs. Let's now pivot to my next question, which is, why do you believe FHIR is critical to advancing automation and reducing burden? And I'd like to kick it off with Samira from Providence.
Thank you. Can I preface my response with portalitis is an amazing term. I'm going to personally start using it. So for this answer, Alex, I want to put my value-based care hat on, because I think there's two ways to look at this. One, if we look at all of the patients, right, fee-for-service populations and so forth, I think we overwhelmingly focus on individual transactions, right? You're requesting individual data for a patient, you're sharing individual data, prior authorizations, and so forth. And I think that's extremely important, but I'll tailor my answer towards value-based care. And for anybody who's on the call who is unfamiliar with value-based care, essentially what it is you have a payer and a provider, or multiple providers if you have a clinically integrated network or a high-performance network where you're partnering with others. You enter into a contract, a legal contract, where the goal of all parties is to provide the highest quality care for patients with an emphasis on preventative services, right, at the lowest cost. So patients benefit, providers benefit, payers benefit at the end. And what I've found in my experience over these past 15 or so years in healthcare, not all of them with value-based care, of course, but the last 8 or so in value-based care, is that healthcare transactions for fee-for-service vary greatly from the value-based care space. And what I mean by that is, within value-based care, you focus on patient populations. So after you enter into this contract with a payer partner, you as a provider are waiting to receive an enrollment list to see who are all the members that are part of that are attributed or assigned to you within that contract, right? What that looks like right now is, and again, I know I'm a broken record, I've said this so many times, but it's extremely messy. It's we as providers receive this data in different formats, whether that be in CSV or TXT files or Excel, or through portals, as Kirk mentioned, through email. Sometimes SFTP is very popular, and if you're a provider who's very lucky to have an automated SFTP process, you're winning, especially for the retrieval and disbursement process. But it's messy. And so the question being, is FHIR critical to advancing and automation or reducing burden? Absolutely. For that first use case, when you are in a value-based care contract, for you as a provider to receive your enrollment list, I know Kirk again mentioned 40, 50, 60 partnerships. Providence has around 200. For you to be able to receive a list of enrolled patients for your value-based care contract in a standardized way, where every month you're not looking at the data and you're not normalizing it and you're not mapping your data elements to some internal concept you've created, right? You're not having to revalidate. You have a process of through an API, retrieving the data, storing it in your FHIR server, providing automated checks. Like, that is golden. That saves you so much administrative burden. And for the same thing, going out, right? A value-based care contract is a bi-directional relationship. Everything is for the benefit of the patient. But in order for both providers and payers to be able to provide services to the patients, they both need specific data. For payers, We as providers want to send clinical data, right, to be able to close gaps, to be able to build that longitudinal patient record for many other reasons. And I imagine the payers who are on this call can probably say that they're receiving data in flat file formats in all sorts of different ways. I've talked to some providers who say that they go into the chart and they manually extract the data and put it into an Excel document, and they're saying, okay, this looks like this is going to fit the colonoscopy measure. You don't want that. You don't want to have to normalize that data from dozens of providers that you're partnering with. You don't want to have to waste administrative resources on that. You want US core compliant data through a FHIR API, utilizing CDEX to be able to close those gaps, to be able to ingest the data cleanly and do additional analysis. And so just to recap and to go back to your question, Alex, do I think that this FHIR work is beneficial in reducing burden and advancing automation? Absolutely. But I also will take it a step further and say I think it's absolutely necessary for value-based care to be a success, because if you're wasting so many of your resources on manual data extraction and normalization and trying to make sense of all these data dictionaries, you're wasting time that could be applied elsewhere.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Hans, do you want to take the same question about why you believe FHIR is critical to advancing automation and reducing burden?
Sure. I think some of the elements have already been brought up, but I think to highlight a specific part of that, FHIR is a standard that enables a class of APIs that to date, with the traditional standards and traditional APIs, has not been as feasible. It allows you to be more granular, data element level. I can go way up to large data sets. I can go into document form. I can go into messages. There's a large variety of capabilities that you can have. And particularly right now, the green field there is around these very focused APIs that I can with more pinpoint accuracy identify the data that I need, which is very helpful when you are trying to get from outside the end of the workflow and interact with somebody else to inside the workflow and start to interact in the right context with the right information, what you need at that point in time, and a variety of other perspectives. So that level of interactivity that I can start to now consider as well. It was harder, not impossible, harder to do if I'm looking at the data element level that I can go down to more easily, that I'm not locked into some predefined formats, which I sometimes still need, but not always. It's that kind of capabilities that that FHIR as the standard enables APIs to now implement. And it can therefore right-size the data better. Is that where there's the, Kirk mentioned that as well, is that you get the right data, not too much, not too little, you get what you want and what you need. Whether you go to different use cases, almost everywhere, it's EPA, CDEX, PDEX, whatever it might be, I can scale up and down and sideways to do that and stay consistent in my expression. You don't have to switch between, oh, for this purpose, I need to be in V2, which we all know is not exactly the same as FHIR, or not exactly the same as NCPDP or X12 or whatever. I can maintain the same language and go up and down and sideways. So I think that's really that expressibility of the interactions and the kinds of interactions that I can do, that FHIR is ideally suited to support and flex with that. And that's, I think, what then can help us, the next step, reduce the burden and improve the automation to do it where we need to do it.
Thank you. Really robust answer. Viet, would you like to add anything into this particular question set?
Sure. I'd like to try to answer this question, excuse me, by way of parallel. Healthcare, we love innovation, but we're actually about 15 years behind the rest of the internet industry around the use of APIs. So imagine if you went to your e-commerce site today, and when you picked your item and you went to go pay for it, you had to open another browser window, enter all the payment information and that e-commerce site in order to pay for the item. And then when you went to figure out how you get it shipped to you, you had to open up another browser to pick your favorite shipper to be able to do it. And then you'd have to use all these different sites in order to do a process of identifying an item you want to purchase and paying for it and getting it delivered and monitoring that process. Healthcare has this opportunity now to recognize that we have common workflows in both clinical care and administrative care, that these APIs through FHIR and the FHIR standard to automate and standardize a set of workflows so that the individual organizations, the providers, the payers, can spend more of their time delivering care and making sure patients have coverage, as opposed to spending time and energy maintaining a set of inefficient processes that could be automated in the same way many other industries, not just e-commerce, but travel, banking has done, that allows for additional savings that could be applied to providing more care to patients. So it's not exactly a FHIR answer, but for those who are not familiar with FHIR, it's an example that I think most of us can appreciate the benefits of APIs. Thanks.
That's a great response, especially considering your background as a medical doctor and an informaticist, as well as a standards developer. It really brings a great view to paralleling it to the other parts of our lives. So I'm going to move on to my third question. As our nation continues to pivot to whole person care and outcomes in our care delivery and reimbursement models, can you describe the data need challenges you are facing? Meaning, what are your supplemental information needs and interactions as you seek to shift to real-time interactions and APIs as enabled by HL7 standards to meet those needs? And I'd like to kick it off with Crystal.
Thanks, Alex. So at Elements, we're taking the whole health holistic view that can transform health. It's one that considers not just traditional physical factors, but behavioral and social factors too. We make it clear that health is a result of our daily experiences and circumstances, from what we eat and where we live to our place of employment and even how we get to work. When we consider the whole person and factors that influence their health, we can make lasting positive change. Elements Health is putting our approach into action by partnering with HL7 Da Vinci and other accelerators and communities to design and implement inclusive strategies that will drive health forward. This is including, but not limited to, value-based care contracting, clinical data exchange, social determinants of health, and patient access. We support ongoing private-public work on data standards and interoperability using advanced health equity, including advanced standardization collection and the use case of race, ethnicity, language, and other sensitive data. So as we contribute to our whole health for our approach with our patients and our members, we're always considering privacy and security, data standards and interoperability, data collection, and education and trust building with our communities. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. It's a lot of data needs. All right, so next, Samira, would you like to offer your perspectives on the supplemental data needs and interactions as you shift to real-time interactions?
Yes, so I love real-time interactions. Let me preface this because given that this question was targeted towards value-based care, right, or whole person care, I think it's important that we put a bit of a plug here for the VBPR, the value-based performance reporting use case that's currently being developed through Da Vinci. And I'll tell you why. So if you are a provider and you have a value-based care contract, well, let me back up. If you are a provider, you know that you need to generate revenue in order to be able to provide care to your patients, right? Step one. Without that revenue, your doors close. You have to lay off a lot of people. There's all these bad things that can happen. And so if you're within a value-based care agreement, and a stipulation of that agreement is that if you're able to generate shared savings, or if you're able to meet quality benchmarks, you're able to share in an X amount of dollars with your payer partner to then be able to in turn give back to your patients in your community, right? Now imagine you're in a situation where you have, let's say 30 contracts, forget 200. And if you perform well in those 30 contracts, let's say you generate around $20 million and you have these lofty plans for how you can give back to your patients and do all this stuff. So you're doing your best, you're tracking quality internally, perhaps through your EMR. You're using those enrollment lists that you get through ATR, and you're reaching out to your patients, you're making sure that they're receiving care upstream. And then at the end of the performance here, you're waiting to receive your preliminary profit and loss statement or performance report or whatever you'd like to call it. You're shocked, you're losing $1,000. And this happens often, right? Not that you should be losing money, but you're shocked because throughout that performance year, as you were doing outreach to your patients, as you were trying to close quality gaps, as you were tracking spend and looking at patient risk and everything else, you weren't receiving data. So the payer being the arbiter, the payer being the adjudicator of claims and all this stuff, right, is on the line with this partnership to be able to give you performance reports. And payers are doing their best. So this isn't that by any means. They're doing their best and they're sharing data in different formats. And so with your question, Alex, in terms of what additional data do you need and real-time data, this is a really big category. We need real-time API-driven financial data for our contracts. We need to be able to collaborate very closely with our payer partners, with the vendors in the industry to say, how do we collectively view these contracts? What characteristics of these contracts can we share regularly to make sure that we are providing the best care to our patients, that we're focusing on outreach, but that payers are as well, and that we have that bottom line always at the forefront? Because at the end of the day, if we're not generating revenue, we can't afford to serve our patients, right? So that is one area that I think is massive. And if anyone else is interested in learning more, or if you're having the same issues, that VBPR call is, it's a good foundation for being able to put your ideas together and being able to work together towards developing this nationwide value-based care exchange framework for performance and finance.
Yeah, well, thank you. So Hans, would you like to add any commentary to this question?
Maybe just a general thought there is that as you're looking at whole health, you're expanding, particularly from the healthcare settings to the health management and health settings. There are more stakeholders, there are more participants, there are more parties involved, perspectives involved that I need to pull together a complete record or a complete set of information from, and I think that's one of the challenges. That what are those data needs? And how can I get to that? What's the best source? What's the best venue to get it through, either directly from the patient, through clinicians, other sources? I think in order to puzzle that together, I think what we're seeing is that the variety of data that you now need to look at has expanded. The variety and the ways and means that are available to everybody technologically to participate in that have varied, but they have a very common thread of based on what's happening generally. And going back to Viet's, we are 15 years behind in some ways. It's some of the internet technologies and otherwise where there is that's out there, but what we have used in the healthcare settings is not totally aligned with that. But the technologies and the standards that are now coming in play are really starting to address those challenges. But it's getting to the right parties, knowing where to get what data that's meaningful to the respective participants.
Thank you, Hans. Some great commentary. And what I'm going to try to do is actually wrap two of our questions into one. And I'm going to cut out one of our questions because I know we've got some great commentary or questions coming in that I want to make sure we get to today. So I would like to run the table and have you speak, if you so choose, to why FHIR will bring flexibility and to improve, making it better for patients and the workforce, and how that translates also into the value proposition of your organization and why you're investing in FHIR. So you have the flexibility to make your couple minutes of comment related to why FHIR is going to help make it better for the workforce and patients, and why that's a value proposition for your organization. And I am going to kick it off with Kirk. And you're on mute, my friend. First one, not bad.
First one, I thought we were going to make it all the way through. Well, I think first let me answer the value proposition part of that question. What is the value proposition for what we're investing in here? I mean, it's really the same as the value proposition for everything that we're doing. It's those triple aim initiatives or quadruple aim initiatives. We want to get better clinical outcomes for our members. We want to reduce cost, and a lot of that cost is reflective in the waste. I saw an estimate $50 billion a year just flushed in the inefficient ways payers and providers exchange data. And we want to improve the experience for patients as well as for the providers who are providing that care and payers who are helping patients pay for that care. So the work that we do in collaboration with providers is an opportunity to move the needle in a significant way in every one of those categories. From the patient perspective, you know, one of the top calls into our customer support here at our payer company is about the status of a prior authorization. And because of all of the historical inefficiencies in how prior auth is done to date, those prior auths can take days. We all know that. And that they are taking days usually means payers are spending a lot of time, i.e. money, sorting through those determinations because they don't have the right data that they need, or for any of the reasons I've already touched on ad nauseum today. So by moving this business process, but this applies to all of the other many of the other use cases we're working on in Da Vinci. It applies equally to care gap closures. It applies to risk adjustment. In all of these areas, we're doing the work today. These aren't new business cases. These aren't new use cases for healthcare. They're all getting done today. They're just getting done in a very inefficient way, typically in a way that is not delivering the security and privacy of member and patient data that we would all want to do. And worst off, we're doing it in a ad hoc way per provider or per payer. We're reinventing the same wheel 50 times, 200 times. That's where that waste comes through. So APIs allow us to move to real-time, highly automated, distributed applications. The openness of those APIs gets us out, and when I say open, I mean it's an open standard. It's not anybody's proprietary secret sauce. It shouldn't be. But that is critical so that when we invest in something, we know it's going to work no matter what EMR system our provider might be using. And they know the same from their perspective, not having to ensure that payer is using vendor X or vendor Y.
Thank you. Viet, would you like to add to that conversation around value proposition and why it's going to be better for workforce and patients?
Yes, I agree with Kirk around the efficiency. I think also for the workforce development, we have the opportunity to leverage folks that are just joining healthcare but have lots of technological expertise in other industries. And then finally, I think this is an important point for those who are new to FHIR, but I think folks are on the panel would appreciate, is that there's this opportunity to use this interoperable data as a strategic advantage, to take the data and then look for new and innovative ways to deliver care, as well as new and innovative ways to more efficiently cover patients and provide new benefits to patients. That just thinking about the compliance part of it is, in my opinion, kind of short-sighted, because we have this opportunity to not just free the data, of course, securely and privately, but also leverage that data to deliver better care.
Thank you, Viet. Hans.
I think what we're hearing and the examples that are used and that where it all, in my mind, comes back to, data is just there. It's available. It's efficient. It's timely. It's complete. It's there. And that's, I think, what it's about. And that's where I think the value propositions are, is that FHIR is just adding to the toolkit to make that better, make that happen where it wasn't before, make it better where it was happening, but too slow. Or that we got too much data. We still will get a boatload of data across. FHIR can help improve on that. We know that there's a lot of data that's being shared. A lot of data is duplicative that is out there that we need to sift through. So part of it, when we talk about interoperability, is that where does it stop? Well, it actually stops once another system starts to use it and does with it what it can do best. But there is in that part that element of we need to be able to ensure that it allows the other system to also weed through it, dedupe it, shrink it down to actually the data that's new. So that there is not only timely, efficient, etc., but it's the new data that I didn't know about before. So to me, that's what it comes down to, and that's where the value proposition is and where FHIR can contribute. The data is just there.
All right, thank you. Crystal.
Just let me get off mute here.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, FHIR for us, we really look at existing data sources and the new API technologies to really help us with our administrative and clinical use cases. So it helps us become more efficient by leveraging the real-time communication with our providers and our members. For us, FHIR provides a solution by offering resource domains which automate sharing, health data for payer-to-payer, burden reduction, clinical data exchange, patient access APIs while using already our established web technologies. So it promotes healthcare industry and moves to enable and ingest, which is really important, the structured documentation, which leads to automation within a payer. Other things just for the proposition, I'm just going to skip because I had a lot more to say, but we're running out of time. Our proposition, the FHIR value of proposition for Elevance Health is it reduces the burden for providers, kind of what Kurt was saying, payers and patients by promoting real-time quality care, administrative and clinical support, increased reliability of shared information, and allowing access to patient members' information from multiple healthcare providers and services.
Thank you. There's a lot of good value in all of this. Samira, would you like to bring us home before we welcome Jocelyn to ask us questions from the audience?
I will keep this short and sweet. I agree with my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So Jocelyn, I know there's a lot of questions and a flurry of background chatter. So could you please present the questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure.
7 minutes.
Really fantastic job, guys, and it's entertaining to watch you all. Folks that were, I think, virtually strangers 4 or 5 years ago, sort of interplay and play off of each other. So it's really welcome, and I think gets across the sense of community that we have here, in addition to sort of the collaboration to actually build standards. The convening aspect of this environment, I think, is really the sort of silver lining and sort of gift that we've gotten out of all this work, and I'm thankful for you all. So I'm gonna do 2 questions, but I'm gonna ask you guys to be rapid fire answer because I timed your last question and it took you almost 7 minutes to get through everybody to answer it. So the first is just, we had some questions about sort of the role of bulk and how that fits in with the Da Vinci IG. So I'm going to pitch that to Viet, and maybe if 1 or 2 of you guys wants to talk a little bit about sort of the role of bulk and why it's going to be important beyond just the real-time APIs.
Great. Great. So for those unfamiliar with bulk, it's the way of requesting information on multiple patients and large volumes of data. So with those 2 things in mind, we are reevaluating all of our implementation guides to see where bulk might be a beneficial way of exchanging information, where real time is not as important and where exchanging large volumes is very important. So in the payer-to-payer data exchange, the use of the member attribution as a starting point for a patient list, and for provider access API, prior auth tends to be something we want to do more real time, and it's on an individual patient level. So at this time, we don't see a good use case for using bulk, but we are evaluating it with the rest of the FHIR community and for our Da Vinci IGs.
Anyone else want to dive in there on bulk? Because we could definitely move on to wrapping us up because we're down to the wire. So I think that, to me, we've been fielding a bunch of the questions and answering as many of them to reply all to everybody so folks can see the other questions coming in. I think that about halfway through Kirk's talk track at the beginning of the session, the beginning of the panel presentation, we had somebody drop in a message to say, how do we take what MCC and the folks at Regents and Cambia have done and make it repeatable? So I want, maybe just as our wrap up, again, thank you all for participating. Thank you, Alex, for pulling off this very complicated hour and a half, and Leslie for your support. Just give us sort of your lightning round answer. Like, what is it that you think we're going to be able to do as an industry to make this repeatable? And we'll wrap up after that. And why don't we start with Samira, and Kirk, why don't you be the last speaker?
Okay, so starting with me as it pertains to prior authorization.
So just how do we make it repeatable? Because I think it's more than just prior auth. Yep.
Okay, perfect. That definitely works a lot better. So I think, and I'll speak a little bit faster given the time, but I think if we look at specific use cases, and I know the question a moment ago was about bulk, member attribution, instead of going back and forth between payers and providers, deciding what data elements to include and what they actually mean and building these data dictionaries, you're using the HIR profile, you're implementing it with a single payer. Perhaps with your second payer, you might have a few additional extensions, but for the most part, scalability is there. Same thing with CDEX. If you're looking at bulk clinical data exchange for a specific use case, we're looking at HEDIS gap closure. The HEDIS standard is the same across the board, and so there's definitely a scalability component there. Obviously, you want to understand your customers and their needs and so forth. I would imagine the same thing would be true about risk, and the same thing would be true about BDPR, depending on what line of business you're looking at. So I think the benefit here is that regardless of what you implement in terms of scalability, obviously your security and infrastructure is already built. You're not having to reconfigure connections individually. Well, I guess with end-to-end you kind of do, but you know what I mean in terms of specific servers that somebody's hosting somewhere and so forth. But you're also in agreement with what data elements fit what use case, and you have specific definitions for each of those data elements. In today's value-based care world, you do not. All of that is proprietary. So the fact that you're starting with data that everybody's agreeing upon, you have an API standard, scalability is absolutely there.
Awesome.
Hope that was fast enough.
Crystal, why don't you go?
Sure. So it's a great question. If what we're doing here is not repeatable and not scalable, then we're not going to achieve the vision that we all have. The way that we know that it is going to be scalable and repeatable comes down to basically a couple of concepts or ideas. The first is the implementation guides that we keep referring to. They're public. They are there for anyone to take and use and implement for free. There's nothing proprietary or secret about how we have done at Regents with multi-care, how that was done. You can see how it was done. What's going to happen is payers are going to develop their own sort of payer side interoperability capabilities, their payer FHIR capabilities. They may choose to develop that internally on their own, as we have done, or they may choose to partner up with a third party. Either way, so long as what is being built to are those public implementation guides, they can rest assured that it will sync up and work with the provider side of interoperability, which is also keying off of those implementation guides. Over time, as I mentioned, we're going to see the provider EMR systems, including these capabilities out of the box. And until such time as that is the case, we have the flexibility of the SMART framework to kind of bridge us to that moment in time where we don't need it anymore. And we can just do FHIR-based prior auth and FHIR-based gaps in care and FHIR-based risk adjustment, et cetera, with no more effort than we use HTTP or SFTP or whatever today. That's what we're talking about when we talk about making this a common utility that all payers, providers, and everyone else in healthcare leverages because it's free, it's open, it's consistent, and it's scalable.
So I'm going to call us because we're at time. I know that we could go on for another 30 minutes. Thank you all for really all of the time and effort that you put into the community, not just in today's call, and really excited to hear about your progress and your success. And thanks to the folks that presented in the first half of the session, really just helping keep everybody on the same page about where we're headed and share some insights into where Da Vinci is headed with our feedback about the guides. And as you heard both Denise and Alex speak to, we'll be sharing our draft documents and final documents as soon as we're able to. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to the team.
See you back on March 22nd, and please remember to take a few minutes and give us feedback through our survey.